The colonel leaned back in his chair, smirking at the young woman in uniform. "You? With them?" he scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. The room of officers chuckled softly, dismissing her presence as nothing more than a mistake. But the laughter died instantly when the phone on the desk rang, and the president's voice echoed through the speaker. He didn't use her name. He didn't use her rank. He called her by a call sign, one that only legends in the field had ever earned. The colonel's smile vanished. Suddenly, everyone in the room realized she wasn't here by accident. The conference room was thick with the smell of coffee and authority. Bronze plaques lined the walls, portraits of decorated generals stared down from above, and every seat was filled with men who carried decades of service etched into their posture. At the head of the long oak table sat Colonel Hargrove, broad-shouldered, square-jawed, and confident in the way only a man certain of his place in the world could be. Then she walked in. The hush that fell over the room wasn't out of respect. It was curiosity and disbelief. She was younger than most of the aides, slender in her tailored uniform, her insignia gleaming in the fluorescent light. Her stride was measured, calm, but her very presence seemed to ripple against the unspoken rules of this room. Colonel Hargrove broke the silence first. He leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head, and let out a scoff that carried across the table. "You've got to be kidding me," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "This is who they sent." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Not cruel, exactly, but the kind of laughter that signaled everyone understood the joke. It was the kind of laughter that dismissed her before she'd even spoken. She didn't flinch. She set her folder down neatly in front of her, eyes forward, shoulders squared. Not a word. "Look, Lieutenant," Hargrove continued, exaggerating the word as if it were beneath him. "This isn't flight school, and it's not a PR stunt. We are talking about coordinating with special forces here. People's lives on the line. You understand that, don't you?" A couple of the younger officers shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to interrupt him. She simply met his gaze. Cool. Unmoved. Something about her silence unnerved him, though he'd never admit it. He expected her to stammer, to fumble, to try to prove herself. Instead, she gave him nothing. He pushed further. "Tell me, exactly what makes you think you belong in this room?" For the first time, she moved. She opened her folder, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished oak toward him, and waited. Hargrove glanced down. His brow furrowed. Classified clearance. Access levels far above his own. But that wasn't what caught his attention. It was the small, handwritten note at the bottom, authorization stamped with the presidential seal. Before he could speak, the desk phone at his elbow rang. The sound was sharp, startling, slicing through the tension like a blade. All eyes turned. Hargrove hesitated, then picked it up. A voice came through the line. Calm. Commanding. Undeniably familiar. "The President of the United States." "Hargrove," the voice said, "I trust you're treating Raven with the respect she deserves." The room froze. Raven. Not Lieutenant. Not even by her real name. A call sign. The kind reserved for operatives whose reputations carried weight beyond rank, beyond paperwork. The colonel's smirk vanished. And for the first time in his career, he had no words. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Raven. For most of the men in the room, it meant nothing. A bird, a call sign, maybe even a mistake. But to the few who had brushed shoulders with the darker corners of military intelligence, the word carried weight, the kind that silenced laughter and froze mockery in its tracks. Raven did not sit taller when she heard it. She did not smirk or glance around to bask in the shock. She remained perfectly still, hands folded on the table, eyes fixed forward, as if the president himself had only reminded her of something she already knew. The colonel slowly set the receiver down. He could feel the eyes of every officer boring into him, waiting to see how he would recover from this humiliation. But even he was wrestling with something deeper, a gnawing memory. He'd heard that name before. Not in any official briefing. Not in the academy. But in hushed conversations among men who never told war stories in public. Raven. Her reputation was never recorded in files that circulated through bases or command posts. It existed in whispers, of missions gone right when every calculation predicted failure, of operations that remained classified not because they'd gone wrong, but because they had succeeded in ways no one was supposed to know. The officers in the room didn't know any of this. They only saw a young woman whose authority had just been validated at the highest level. But the colonel, he remembered pieces. A hostage crisis in the Balkans, where no one could explain how the captives had been extracted without a single shot fired. An ambush in the desert, where a squad walked out alive against impossible odds, and the only clue to how was the faint, painted image of a black bird left on the enemy's map. He had dismissed the stories then. Soldiers love their myths. But myths don't get endorsed by the commander-in-chief. As Hargrove's thoughts churned, Raven's mind was elsewhere. She did not like hearing that name spoken in public spaces. It belonged to another life, a shadow life she had carried alone for years. For her, the call sign was not a badge of honor but a reminder of what it had cost. The nights waiting for extraction under freezing skies. The teammates she never saw again. The scars invisible to everyone but her. The president's voice had not been meant for the colonel. It had been meant for her. A warning and a reassurance in one. You're not forgotten. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself, then let the room settle into silence. It was not her job to defend herself. It was not her job to boast or explain. The president had already done that with a single word. Colonel Hargrove finally cleared his throat, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. He said, the word catching slightly as if unfamiliar on his tongue. Perhaps you should lead the briefing. For the first time, Raven allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. Not because she needed his respect, but because she knew, whether he admitted it or not, he finally understood. The shift in the room was subtle at first. No one dared to speak, but their posture betrayed them. Arms that had been folded in skepticism now rested quietly on the table. Shoulders that had leaned back in dismissal edged forward with attention. Every eye followed her, waiting, as though the room itself had realigned around her presence. Raven didn't rush. She reached into her folder, slid out a series of maps and intelligence photos, and spread them across the oak table. Her movements were precise, unhurried, the same way she had moved through operations where hesitation meant death. We'll start with the satellite images from 3 nights ago, she said calmly. Her voice was steady, clear, without theatrics. She spoke as though the material wasn't classified, as though every line of intelligence was second nature to her. The colonel, now silent, watched closely. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced by something else, calculation. He was a man used to being the most experienced in the room, but he could already see it. She wasn't simply briefing them. She was guiding them, as if she had already walked this battlefield herself. An officer interrupted timidly. With respect, the insertion point you're suggesting, she looked at him, her gaze sharp but not unkind, was used in '09. It's mine now. Unless you want your men walking into a kill zone, you'll listen. The room fell silent again. The younger officer swallowed hard, nodded, and scribbled into his notes. Raven continued. She laid out contingencies, escape routes, fallback positions, each delivered with the kind of certainty that only comes from lived experience. She never once raised a voice. She didn't need to. Authority radiated from her in the form of knowledge, precision, and a history that no one in the room could match. By the time she finished, the once skeptical officers were leaning over the table, studying her maps as if they were gospel. Questions came, but now they were respectful, genuine, asked not to challenge her but to learn from her. And the colonel? He remained quiet until the very end. When the briefing concluded, he rose to his feet. For a moment, it seemed as though he might resist, that his pride would not allow him to acknowledge the truth before all these men. But then, slowly, deliberately, he placed his hand on the table and gave a single, sharp nod. Raven, he said. No sarcasm, no mockery. Just acknowledgement. She looked at him, expression unreadable, and gathered her papers. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Respect was not something she had ever asked for. It was something earned in silence, through scars no one else could see. As she walked from the room, the officers followed her with their eyes. For them, she was no longer just a young woman in uniform. She was Raven, the one the president knew by call sign. And the colonel, left standing at the head of the table, finally understood what the rest of them were only beginning to realize. She didn't need their approval. They needed her.